Oh, good, it's time for the main act here. Last Sunday's order of service said that this week I'd be preaching. To me, the word preaching implies some sort of moral exhortation. Go ye and sin no more. I'm certainly capable of preaching, but I'm not planning to do that today. This will be more of an old-style Unitarian fellowship service. I thought it would be fun to share one or two ideas that you might find provocative. When I first suggested to Stephanie that I'd like to do a service about storytelling, I hadn't quite realized what a multifaceted topic it would turn out to be. In some sense, storytelling is a central part of the experience of being human. As Australian author Kate Forsyth observes, storytelling is as old as speech. It existed before humans first began to carve shapes in stones and press their hands upon the rocky walls of caves. Today, we tend to think of storytelling as an activity for experts, for professionals like Stephen King and Margaret Atwood. But in truth, we all tell stories. When an early human said, I go around lake, lion chase me, I run fast, that was a story. Other animals are many things: intelligent, caring, creative, sensitive, observant, and some species do have rather large sets of vocal sounds that convey specific meanings, but as far as we know, only the human animal tells stories. In a sense, language is story. With language, we can summon up things and places that are not here. We can describe actions that took place in the past or that may take place in the future. Everything in every story you will ever read is an elaboration of those basic functions. As Eric Hoffer put it, and in the interest of accuracy, I'm not going to regender the quote, man is eminently a storyteller. His search for a purpose, a cause, an ideal, a mission, and the like is largely a search for a plot and a pattern in the development of his life story. We tell stories to our friends and family, stories about happy occasions or traumatic moments or unexpected encounters with old friends. Stories are how we become part of one another's lives. They build communities and close relationships. Sometimes stories are told primarily in order to be useful. If someone says to you, don't take the 580 this morning, there's an awful backup because a big rig jackknife, the radio said it wouldn't be clear for hours. That's a story, and it's mainly utilitarian, but really it's both, because sharing a story that's useful is a way of saying implicitly, I care about you, about your comfort and convenience. Storytelling goes far beyond conversation, though. We tell stories to ourselves silently over and over during the course of a day, stories about our own lives or about social encounters we wish had gone differently. These stories are how we define ourselves as individual human beings. The mind, when idle, repeats them. They're burned in. Without our silent internal stories, would we even know who we are? There's something to think about. The stories we read can take us to other places and times and tell us how people lived, how their lives were so much like ours and yet so different. We can read Chaucer and learn about life in England in the 14th century, or Faulkner and learn about life in the South in the years after the Civil War. The people in these stories may be imaginary, but their lives are surely drawn from the real experiences of people who lived in those days. Our view of the world we live in is hugely expanded by stories. And here's what's miraculous. We can come to know and care about people who never existed, just as if they were sitting across the dinner table from us. We feel that we know Harry Potter and Hamlet and Huckleberry Finn. Stories create new realities for us, realities that may be more beautiful than any we could ever experience, or more terrifying. In reading stories for an hour or two, we can imagine ourselves more courageous than we would ever dare to be, or more lascivious, or more cruel. We can release emotions that might otherwise fester. And sometimes the world of make-believe is just a more pleasant place to hang out than the real world. There's that too. Our lives are richer because we can dally for an hour in a story that's just plain fun. Don't you agree? Yes, that's true. Those who never indulge in stories just for fun, impoverish their own lives. Why do we read stories to our children? To divert and entertain them, yes, but also to give them some basic tools with which to understand the world. Lectures don't seem to do most of us much good, not when we're young and not when we're grown up either. Ideas about good and evil, about loyalty and value and making difficult choices are far more effectively absorbed when they're packaged up in stories. Would George Orwell be remembered today if he had written an essay about the evils of fascism rather than writing 1984? Okay, it's true, Hannah Arendt wrote essays on fascism and she's remembered, but most of us feel a closer connection with 1984. Part of the magic of storytelling, and perhaps one of the reasons why it works as well as it does, is that a story is always incomplete. Many details are always omitted. The storyteller trusts that the listener or reader will fill in the gaps seamlessly out of their own imagination and their knowledge of the world, and without quite realizing that they're doing so. As we read to our children, we help them learn how to fill in those gaps. A listener who couldn't do this trick would have a difficult time in life. Our larger stories, though, call them myths, if you like, define our culture and shape our world. An old miser being confronted on Christmas Eve with the ghost of his own future and learning what it means to be kind and loving. Or a boy and a runaway slave floating down the Mississippi River on a raft, and how the boy wrestled with what he was doing and decided that if being true to his friend Jim meant he would be sent to hell, he would do it anyway. We all know that one. These are the stories that make us what we are. They give shape and permanence to our feelings. Without them, we would be truly lost. There are also more mundane stories that shape our culture and perceptions in ways that we may or may not recognize. A few novels have had an obvious and lasting social impact, but even novels that seem mere entertainment may shape our view of the world. 75 years ago, when the happy ending of a mystery novel was reached, the murderer was turned over to the police. Typically, the authors of these stories assumed that the criminal justice system worked, even though in fact it often didn't work very well. The stories reinforced a coherent social structure by providing a narrative that explained how good and evil were to be recognized and dealt with. Today, in contrast, crime novels, TV shows, and movies quite often portray the good guy as having to dispense justice by hand because the criminal justice system can't be relied on. As indeed it can't, but when the message being presented by 1,000 stories is, in essence, the way to achieve justice is to shoot the bad guys yourself, social disintegration gets a boost. We need to pay attention to the hidden meanings in these stories because the hidden meanings do make a difference. When embedded in a story, an idea can bypass our critical thinking. Would Ayn Rand's despicable conservative ideas have been as influential if she hadn't bundled them up in novels? Not that her ideas were hidden, of course. The story in Atlas Shrugged was a thin wrapper around an extended polemic, but it's still, I'm sorry to say, widely admired. As screenwriter John Rogers said, there are two novels that can change a bookish 14-year-old's life: The Lord of the Rings and Atlas Shrugged. One is a childish fantasy that often engenders a lifelong obsession with its unbelievable heroes, leading to an emotionally stunted, socially crippled adulthood in which one is unable to deal with the real world. The other, of course, involves orcs. The vital point to understand about storytelling is this: stories can be changed. Stories can be changed. The stories we're told may inspire us, but they don't define us unless we let them. Salman Rushdie put it this way: those who do not have power over the story that dominates their lives, the power to retell it, rethink it, deconstruct it, joke about it, and change it as times change, truly are powerless because they cannot think new thoughts. In order to change a story, we need to drill down beneath the surface layer. We need to ask ourselves what our heroes' value systems are, how they deal with evil, and what sorts of things are being presented as good or evil. We need to understand their aspirations and notice their blind spots. This morning's opening reading was from the opening pages of Mark Twain's Diary of Adam and Eve, as I'm sure most of you realized. It illustrates how stories can be changed. That passage would have been understood instantly by everyone in Twain's audience. But he took the familiar materials and recast the story in a radical and rather sarcastic way. Even as hallowed a story as that one is not carved on stone tablets. If we have the wit and the courage, we can change it. I've had friends say, well, of course, the Bible is not literally true, but it's great literature. But is it? In its original form, the story of the Garden of Eden is frighteningly misguided. Among the themes of the story as it appears in the Bible are these: knowledge is dangerous and ignorance is safe. Nakedness is shameful. We must obey without question those whose rank is superior to our own. If we disobey, not only we, but also our children will be punished, and it is proper that they should be. We are not like the other animals. Our destiny is to rule over them. Women are too easily deceived and give way too easily to their impulses. Does anybody think that if Flannery O'Connor or Truman Capote had written a story with these themes, the New Yorker would have published it? Yeah. We need to rewrite these awful stories. This is part of what psychotherapy does, I'm sure. It helps us change our personal stories about who we are, about what's possible for us as individuals. The old version of a story can be constricting. It can weigh us down. I've heard it said that acceptance is when you finally give up all hope of having a better past. In one sense, that's surely true, yet in another sense, it's very misleading. The past doesn't exist. All we have are the stories we tell ourselves about our past. If you change the story by adding fresh insights or by flipping past a few pages of painful memories without dwelling on them, you can have a better past. We can change a story of tragedy to a story of triumph, a story of oppression to a story of hope. And when we change the story, we begin to change the world. Since I haven't been preaching and don't pray, I can't end this talk by saying Shalom, Namaste, blessed be. The secular humanist benediction, though, is one that I'm sure you've all heard many times. My wish today is that we all live happily ever after.